The sound of clinking glasses, laughter, and slow jazz music filled the grand ballroom of the Knight estate, the mansion of none other than Alexander Knight, the young, impossibly handsome billionaire who had everything a man could ever want. Dressed in a tailored black suit, his sharp jawline and piercing, stormy eyes made him look every bit the king of his world. Alexander sat at the center of his rich, arrogant friends, exuding confidence as he swirled the golden whiskey in his glass. The release load. Love is nothing but a transaction, he declared, leaning back lazily. A chuckle rippled across the table. Says the man who has never fallen in love, one of his friends, Damien, smirked. Alexander smirked back. Because I'm smart. Love is an illusion, and women only care about money. The conversation had started as a joke, but now there was a dangerous glint in Damien's eyes. If you think love is meaningless, let's make it interesting. Alexander raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Damien leaned forward, his smirk deepening. I bet you wouldn't dare marry someone beneath your status. The men at the table burst into laughter. Alexander chuckled too. That's ridiculous. Think about it, Alex. Damien's voice lowered. Could you live with a woman who doesn't adore your wealth? Someone who doesn't care about your money? Someone who won't worship the ground you walk on? Alexander's lips curled into a sly smile. You're underestimating me. Damien shrugged, taking a sip of his drink. Then prove it. Alexander's gray eyes flickered around the room, scanning the people present. A challenge like this? He wouldn't back down. He never did. But who would be his target? His gaze drifted toward the far end of the room, where the household staff moved quietly, refilling glasses and clearing tables. And that's when he saw her. Underscore, 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 underscore. Underscore, 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 underscore. uh, it's standing in the dim glow of the chandeliers was Emily Carter, the newly hired maid. Dressed in a simple black uniform, her chestnut brown hair was loosely tied, a few strands escaping to frame her delicate face. She wasn't like the other maids. There was something about her. Her features were soft, yet her eyes held a quiet fire. Unlike the others, she didn't look nervous or submissive. She moved with poise, with dignity. Her hands carefully arranged a tray of champagne glasses, and as she turned to walk away, her eyes met his. For a second, everything went still. Her eyes were a stunning shade of hazel green, filled with something unreadable. Not fear, not admiration, but something fierce. She held his gaze without flinching. Alexander's smirk grew. Interesting. Horror, he announced suddenly, his voice smooth as silk. I'll marry her. The table fell into stunned silence. Then laughter. Damien nearly choked on his drink. The new maid. Are you insane? You said beneath my status, Alexander replied lazily, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Well, you don't get lower than the help. Across the room, Emily clenched her tray tighter. She had overheard everything. Arrogant, entitled, jerk. But she wouldn't react, not yet. Underscore, 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 underscore. I say again. Anna, 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 Anna. Later that evening, Emily was finishing her work when she felt a presence behind her. A deep, velvety voice brushed against her ear. Do you always eavesdrop, or was that just for fun? Emily turned sharply, her breath catching as she found herself face to face with Alexander Knight. He was too close, too tall, too breathtakingly handsome, too dangerous. His gray eyes danced with amusement and arrogance as he leaned against the doorframe. Emily straightened, masking her emotions. If you talk loudly enough for the whole mansion to hear, it's not eavesdropping. His lips curved. She had fire. Marry me. Emily's eyes widened. Alexander tilted his head. You heard me. Marry me. 1 year. No emotions, no love, just business. She crossed her arms. Why would I ever agree to that? His smirk didn't fade. Because I'll give you a deal you can't refuse. At first, Emily wanted to slap him for his arrogance, but when he told her what he was offering, money that could save her sick younger brother's life, she felt her heart stutter. She gritted her teeth. This is a game to him, a bet, a joke, but to her it could mean survival. Underscore, 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 underscore. Emily's entire body tensed as she looked into his eyes. Stormy gray, filled with confidence, daring her. Would she let him win? Alexander stepped closer, towering over her, his scent, a mix of expensive cologne and something undeniably masculine, filling the space between them. His voice dropped to a whisper. Do we have a deal, sweetheart? Emily's heart pounded violently in her chest. She was strong, independent, proud, but her little brother, he needed help. She exhaled sharply. Fine. Alexander arched an eyebrow. Fine. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze fearlessly. Yes, I'll marry you, Mr. Knight. But don't expect me to fall in love with you. His smirk deepened. We'll see about that. Underscore, 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 underscore. The air between them crackled with something dangerous. Not hatred, not admiration, but something undeniable. Alexander watched as Emily turned and walked away, her curves swaying slightly, her chin held high. He should have felt victorious, but instead, he felt intrigued. And for the first time in his life, he wondered, had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? Underscore, 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 underscore. Uh, um, the best part was Emily stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the luxurious bridal suite, her hands clenched into fists. Outside, the city glittered like diamonds. But inside, her heart was a story. Tomorrow, she was marrying Alexander Knight, a billionaire, a playboy, a man who didn't believe in love, a man who had reduced marriage to a bet. The door swung open, and without turning, she felt his presence before she even saw him. Heat, confidence, power. Are you nervous? His deep, velvety voice sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. Emily turned to face him. Alexander stood there, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his stormy gray eyes watching her intently. She met his gaze fearlessly. No, he smirked. Liar. Emily crossed her arms. I'm not the one playing games. Alexander stepped closer. Too close. Underscore, 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 underscore. Uh, uh, wait, what? When did I get scared into scared for a second? Like, neither am I. His voice dropped, his gaze darkening. Uh, I told you, sweetheart, you'll be mine tomorrow, whether you like it or not. Her breath hitched, not because she was afraid, but because of the way he looked at her, like she was a puzzle he wanted to unravel. Emily swallowed hard. You might have my hand in marriage, Alexander, but you'll never have my heart. For a moment, his expression flickered. Something unreadable flashed in his eyes. Then the smirk returned. We'll see. Underscore 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 underscore. The Grand Cathedral was packed with hundreds of guests, flashing cameras, and the scent of fresh roses. The media had gone wild over the shocking wedding of billionaire Alexander Knight and his maid. As Emily walked down the long, golden aisle, wearing a stunning but simple ivory gown, she felt their eyes on her, judging, whispering, laughing. Her heart hammered, but she lifted her chin. She would not break. At the altar, Alexander stood tall, dressed in a black tuxedo, his gaze locked on her. For the first time, something stirred in his chest. She looked breathtaking, not just beautiful, but powerful, untouchable. As she reached him, she refused to take his hand. Instead, she stared straight into his eyes and whispered, "Enjoy your victory, Mr. Knight." His smirk didn't fade. "Oh, I will, sweetheart." The priest cleared his throat. "Do you, Alexander Knight, take Emily Carter to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Alexander didn't hesitate. "I do." Emily clenched her fists. She had told herself she wouldn't let this affect her. But as she whispered, "I do," something in her chest tightened. The moment his lips brushed against hers in the official wedding kiss, she felt a jolt of heat spread through her. It wasn't supposed to feel this intense, but it did. When they pulled apart, Alexander smirked down at her. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" She met his gaze with fire in her eyes. "You'll regret that." He chuckled, his grip on her waist tightening slightly. "Darling, you're underestimating how much I like a challenge." Underscore 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 under. The Grand Night Mansion was filled with the clinking of glasses, soft music, and the murmurs of New York's elite. Emily stood by the massive windows, gripping her champagne glass tightly. She could feel Alexander's presence across the room, talking with his billionaire friends. She had expected to feel trapped tonight. Instead, she felt something else, something dangerous. I don't know, like, what? She turned sharply to see a handsome stranger, an older billionaire from one of Alexander's rival companies. He smiled smoothly. "You look exquisite tonight." Before she could respond, Alexander was suddenly beside her. His strong arm wrapped possessively around her waist. His touch burned. "She does, doesn't she?" Alexander's voice was cool, but his eyes were dark. The older billionaire smirked. "Careful, Knight. A woman this beautiful won't stay yours forever." Emily stiffened, feeling the tension crackle in the air. Alexander leaned closer, whispering near her ear, "Is wrong, you're mine." A shiver ran down her spine. She hated him. She hated that he could make her heart pound this way. She turned to him, meeting his gaze with challenging defiance. "You don't own me, Alexander." His smirk deepened. "We'll see." Underscore, 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 underscore. The master bedroom of Alexander's mansion was massive, dimly lit by the glow of the city lights outside. Emily walked in, her wedding gown trailing behind her, her breath shallow. This was it, the wedding night. She turned just as Alexander entered, loosening the collar of his tuxedo, his sharp gaze locked on her. The air between them thickened. He was waiting for her to react. She lifted her chin. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Don't expect me to share your bed," she said coldly. His smirk didn't fade. Instead, he stepped closer, backing her against the wall. "I never said I would touch you, sweetheart. Unless—" He leaned in, voice dropping to a husky whisper. "You ask me to." Her breath caught. For a brief, dangerous second, she thought he might actually kiss her. And worse, she wanted him to, but instead he stepped back, his smirk deepening. "Good night, Mrs. Knight." And just like that, he left. Emily let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her racing heart. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to hate him, not feel this. She clenched her fists. Tomorrow, she would remind him why this was just a game, and she would never let him win. Underscore, 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 underscore. Uh, uh, I, I think, I got to a place with a lot more of my stuff, and, the bedroom was silent except for the faint sound of the wind outside. Emily stood near the large window, staring out at the city skyline, her hands gripping the railing. Even though she was now Emily Knight, the wife of Alexander Knight, she felt anything but his wife. Behind her, Alexander loosened his tie, his sharp gray eyes watching her with quiet curiosity. She had barely spoken since they arrived home. His voice was low and smooth. "Are you waiting for something, sweetheart?" She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. "No." Alexander smirked. "Good. Then let's make one thing clear. You and I are married in name only." Emily arched an eyebrow. "Believe me, I have no desire to be anything more to you." A flicker of something flashed in his eyes. Challenge, amusement, or something darker. He stepped closer, his tall frame towering over her. "Then why do you look like you're holding your breath every time I get near you?" Emily's pulse quickened. "I'm not," she lied. His smirk deepened, his hand lifting as if to touch her cheek, but then he stopped, his fingers barely grazing the air between them. Heat, electricity, a dangerous pull. For a brief, reckless moment, Emily thought he might actually kiss her. And worse, she wanted him to. But just as quickly, Alexander's expression turned unreadable. He took a step back. "Good night, Mrs. Knight." Then, without another word, he walked into his private bathroom and shut the door. Emily let out a shaky breath. What the hell was that? Her fingers trembled as she touched her rapidly beating heart. She should hate him. She should be disgusted by this whole arrangement. Then why did she feel like her entire body was on fire? Hours later, Emily was still awake, unable to sleep in the luxurious bed. She could hear Alexander in the adjacent room, pacing. A strange ache settled in her chest. She knew what it felt like to lie awake at night, lost in thoughts. He's just another arrogant billionaire. He doesn't deserve your sympathy. But something inside her whispered, "Are you sure?" She sat up, hesitating before finally walking to his door and knocking lightly. Silence. Then the door swung open. Alexander stood there, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the top, his dark hair slightly messy from running his hands through it. Emily froze. The man who always looked perfectly composed looked human. His voice was hoarse. "What do you want?" She hesitated. "You can't sleep either?" His gray eyes studied her. Then, to her surprise, he sighed and stepped aside, allowing her in. Ooh. Underscore, 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 underscore 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 underscore. Um, I think I I think I the room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp casting shadows across his strong jawline and tired eyes. Emily sat on the couch across from him, folding her hands in her lap. Alexander leaned against the edge of his desk, watching her with curiosity. You're different from what I expected, he admitted. She raised an eyebrow. And what did you expect? He smirked, his voice dripping with arrogance. A woman who would either be terrified of me or desperate for my money. Emily's lips curled slightly. Disappointed, a soft chuckle rumbled from his chest. Not at all. In fact, I think I prefer it this way. She narrowed her eyes. Because you like challenges? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked away, his gaze darkening slightly. For the first time, she saw something in him she hadn't noticed before. A hint of loneliness, a ghost of pain. Her voice softened. Why did you agree to this bet, Alexander? His jaw tightened. Because love is a lie. Emily's breath hitched. You really believe that? His gaze locked on hers. Yes. A heavy silence filled the room. Then she whispered, Who broke your heart? Something flashed in his gray eyes. Shock, pain, and then nothing. A mask falling back into place. No one, he said coldly. I just learned my lesson before it could happen. Emily studied him carefully. You weren't always like this, were you? He didn't answer. But in that silence, she had her answer. Underscore 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 underscore. Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching her intensely. What about you, Emily Carter? His voice dropped. What's your story? She hesitated. No one had asked her that in years. And yet, staring into his gray eyes, she felt the strangest urge to tell him. She swallowed hard. I used to be a pianist. Alexander's eyebrows lifted slightly. A pianist? She nodded, forcing herself to continue. I was supposed to go to Juilliard. I had a promising career ahead of me. Music was my everything. A pause. What happened? His voice was quieter now. Emily let out a shaky breath. I lost it all. A shadow flickered across his face. Her throat tightened. Because of a man. Alexander's expression hardened. Emily forced herself to look at him, her hazel green eyes shining with old pain. It told me he loved me. He said I was his world. And then he destroyed everything I had. He took my trust, my career, my dreams, and left me with nothing. A muscle in Alexander's jaw ticked. He hurt you. Emily let out a bitter laugh. That's an understatement. Alexander was quiet for a long time. Then finally, he murmured, So you don't believe in love either? Emily exhaled softly. I used to. Now I only believe in survival. Something shifted in the air between them. For the first time, they weren't enemies in a forced marriage. For the first time, they were two broken souls staring at each other in the dark. Underscore, underscore. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know. I think Alexander reached for the glass of whiskey on the table, swirling it before taking a slow sip. His eyes never left her. You fascinate me, Emily. Her breath caught. He set the glass down, leaning closer. You fight me at every turn. You look at me like you hate me, but there's something else there too, isn't there? Her heart pounded. You're imagining things. Alexander smirked. Am I? For a brief, reckless moment, the world faded away. It was just them. His face was inches from hers. his breath warm against her lips. And then Emily stood up, abruptly breaking the moment. Good night, Alexander. Her voice was breathless. Alexander watched her walk away, his smirk fading slightly. As the door closed behind her, he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His heart pounded. For the first time in years, he didn't feel empty. For the first time, he felt like he had met his match. And for the first time, he wondered if this bet would cost him far more than he ever expected. Underscore, 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 underscore. Thought. Um, well, I thought ru- um the golden sunlight streamed through the large windows of the night mansion, casting a soft glow over the room. Emily lay awake in the king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling. Married. The word felt foreign on her tongue. She turned her head slightly and froze. Alexander was lying beside her, his broad shoulders, his defined jawline, his slightly tousled midnight black hair. He looked devastatingly handsome, even in sleep. His breathing was steady, his lips slightly parted. He looked so different, so peaceful. She blinked, pushing the thought away. No, this was a game to him, a bet, nothing more. But just as she was about to sit up, Alexander's eyes fluttered open, gray, piercing, and far too intense. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then his lips curved into a lazy, amused smirk. Good morning, Mrs. Knight. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Damn him. She sat up quickly, tightening the silk robe around her. Don't call me that. Alexander stretched, his muscles rippling slightly beneath his loose white shirt. Why not? It's legal, isn't it? His voice was husky from sleep. Or do you regret it already? Emily's eyes narrowed. I never wanted this in the first place. Alexander sat up, leaning toward her. Then why do you look so damn tempted, sweetheart? Her breath hitched. Tempted? She scoffed, masking her emotions. In your dreams, Knight. His smirk deepened. Oh, sweetheart. You have no idea. Damn him twice. She threw the blanket off and stormed out of the room before her heart could betray her any further. The mansion's grand dining hall was quiet, save for the sound of silverware clinking against fine china. Emily sat at the long dining table, pretending to focus on her tea, but she could feel him watching her. Across from her, Alexander took a slow sip of his coffee, his gray eyes gleaming with amusement. You're avoiding looking at me. Emily didn't react. Maybe I just don't like your face. Alexander chuckled. Liar. She finally met his gaze, and the moment their eyes locked, a spark ignited. Challenge, tension, unspoken attraction. Alexander leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Tell me, sweetheart, do all women look at their husbands like they want to murder them, or am I just special? Emily smirked. You're special, all right. But not in the way you think. His deep chuckle sent an uninvited shiver down her spine. He tilted his head. So does that mean you think about me? Even when you hate me? Emily's fingers tightened around her cup. Damn him thrice. She needed to get out of there before she did something reckless. Like kiss that stupid smirk off his face. Later that evening, Emily wandered through the massive halls of the mansion, trying to escape the thoughts invading her mind. She stumbled upon a grand piano, sitting elegantly in the music room. Her heart ached. It had been years since she touched a piano, since she played, since she let music heal her. Before she could stop herself, she sat down. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and then she began to play. A soft, heartbreaking melody filled the air. She closed her eyes, lost in the familiar touch, lost in the emotion. In Thai, that's beautiful. Her fingers froze. Alexander stood in the doorway, his eyes darker than usual. Emily's heart pounded. She hadn't even heard him enter. She stood abruptly. I didn't mean to play. His voice was soft, but it wasn't a request. Emily hesitated. He stepped forward, his gaze locked on hers. Because I want to hear you. Her breath caught, something about the way he said it. It wasn't teasing. It wasn't mocking. It was genuine. Slowly, she sat back down and played. Alexander watched her, completely captivated. He had never seen her like this, lost in something she loved, vulnerable, breathtaking. And for the first time, he realized he wanted to know more about her. Not as a bet, not as a game, but because she was the first woman who had ever made him feel something real. Underscore, 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 underscore. It was important to me that my team, um, after dinner, Alexander found himself walking beside Emily in the mansion's private garden. Neither of them spoke at first. The stars twinkled above, the soft breeze carrying the scent of roses. Then he finally said, "You should play again." Emily scoffed. "It's not that simple." He turned to her. "Why not?" She hesitated. "Because every time I touch the piano, I remember what I lost." A pause. Then, softly, he said, "I know what that feels like." Emily looked up at him, surprised. Alexander never talked about himself. "What did you lose?" she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he whispered, "Something I never had the chance to fight for." Emily's chest tightened. She had spent so much time thinking he was just a cold, heartless man. But maybe there was more to him than she realized. Underscore, 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 underscore. Oh, uh-huh. I mean, I agree with that, right? I mean, it's there is a they stopped walking. The night was silent, just them, just their breathing. Alexander reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. A slow, burning touch. Her breath hitched. His gaze dropped to her lips. Emily's heart pounded violently. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. For the first time, she wanted him to close the distance. His hand lifted, gently cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing against her cheek. So soft, so delicate. The world faded away. He leaned in just a little, just enough for her to feel his breath against her lips. And then, should go. Emily pulled away, her voice unsteady. Alexander's jaw tightened. He didn't stop her, but as he watched her walk away, he knew this wasn't just a game anymore. He wanted her, not just for the bet, not just for the thrill, but because for the first time in his life, he had finally met his match. Emily paced her bedroom, her hands trembling. What the hell just happened? That moment in the garden, Alexander had almost kissed her, and she had almost let him. She clenched her fists. No, this was a game to him. He's playing with me. She had promised herself that she wouldn't fall for him. But why did her heart still race whenever he looked at her? Why did his touch burn like a brand on her skin? And worst, why did she want more? A knock at the door startled her. She turned, already knowing who it was. Alexander, standing in the doorway, his gray eyes dark and unreadable. Couldn't sleep. His voice was smooth, deep, and dangerously soft. Emily hated how much she loved the way he said her name. She crossed her arms. "What do you want, Alexander?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The air thickened. "You walked away," he murmured. "Why?" Her heart pounded. "Because I was afraid." Instead, she lifted her chin. "Because this marriage isn't real." Alexander studied her, his expression unreadable. "Then tell me something, sweetheart." He took another step closer. "If this isn't real, why do you look at me like you're drowning every time I touch you?" Emily's breath caught. He's too close, too intense, too dangerous. But she couldn't let him win. She forced herself to smirk. "Because you're mistaking irritation for attraction, Mr. Knight." His gaze darkened. "Is that so?" Before she could react, he reached out, his fingers lightly brushing against her wrist. A sharp shock of electricity surged through her. Her body betrayed her. She sucked in a breath, but he noticed. His lips curled. "You're lying." Emily yanked her hand away, ignoring the way her skin burned where he touched her. "Go to hell, Alexander." And then she turned and walked away. But this time, he didn't stop her. For the next few days, Emily tried to avoid him. She needed distance, space, air. But Alexander, he didn't like being ignored. So he made sure he was everywhere. At breakfast, in the hallways, at dinners. Each time, his gray eyes followed her, watching, waiting, daring her to react. And every time, she fought the urge to run. Because every time she looked at him, her carefully built walls started to crack. It all exploded one night at a charity gala. Emily had agreed to attend with Alexander, but she had no idea how vicious high society could be. Whispers followed her. That's the maid he married? Would Alexander Knight marry someone like her? I'll get bored soon. She ignored them until a handsome stranger approached her. "You must be Emily," he said smoothly, offering his hand. She took it, smiling politely. "And you are?" "Richard Langston," he introduced, an old acquaintance of Alexander. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "Let me guess. You think this marriage is a mistake, too?" Richard chuckled. "On the contrary, I think you're the most interesting thing to happen to him in years." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment?" Richard leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's a warning." Emily barely had time to process his words before a strong hand wrapped around her waist. "Alexander." And he did not look happy. His jaw was clenched, his gray eyes cold, but his grip on her waist was scalding, possessive, claiming, dangerous. "Langston," he greeted coolly. "Is there a reason you're touching my wife?" Richard smirked. "Relax, Knight. We were just talking." Alexander's grip tightened. "Well, you've talked enough." Emily stiffened. "Alexander, stop it." But he was already pulling her away, guiding her toward the exit. "We're leaving." In the way he said it, there was no room for argument. By the time they reached the car, Emily had had enough. She ripped herself from his grip, eyes blazing. "What the hell was that, Alexander?" He turned, his eyes dark with anger. "That was me protecting what's mine." Her heart stuttered. "My, no, no." She crossed her arms. "I don't belong to you." He took a step closer. "Don't you?" His voice was dangerously soft, but his eyes, they burned. Emily's breath came faster. She needed to stop this. "Now." "This is just a bet," she whispered. "Nothing more." Alexander still. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a cold, knowing smirk. If it's just a bet, then why do you look like you want me to kiss you? Her entire body tensed. I don't. His smirk deepened. Liar. And then he closed the distance. His hands cupped her face, his touch scalding. She barely had time to catch her breath before his lips crashed into hers. The world stopped. Heat exploded in her veins. His kiss was hungry, desperate, consuming. And Emily, she let herself drown. She grabbed his shirt, pulling him closer, deeper. She hated him, and yet her body betrayed her because this wasn't just a kiss. This was everything. And that's when it hit her. She was in trouble. They finally pulled apart, both breathless, shaken. Alexander's forehead rested against hers, his hands still cradling her face. His voice was hoarse, rough. Tell me to stop. Emily's heart pounded. She should. She should tell him this was a mistake. But when she opened her mouth, no words came. Because deep down, she didn't want him to stop. Alexander's gray eyes searched hers. And for the first time, she saw something real, something terrifying, something that looked a lot like love. But before she could process it, he pulled away. His mask slipped back into place. This changes nothing. His voice was cold, distant. Emily's chest tightened. Of course. Of course he'd pretend it meant nothing. She lifted her chin, ignoring the sting in her heart. Then let's never talk about it again. She turned and walked away. But deep down, they both knew nothing would ever be the same again. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers brushing against her lips. She could still feel him. The kiss, the fire, the way his hands had held her, like she was the only thing that mattered. And yet, this changes nothing. His words still echoed in her mind, cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Then why does my heart feel so damn broken? A knock at the door startled her. She already knew who it was. Alexander. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to stay still. Another knock. Emily, open the door. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Not tonight. Not when she still felt like she was drowning. So she said nothing. And after a long, heavy pause, she heard him walk away. And for the first time since she met Alexander Knight, she felt like she had lost something that had never even been hers. The next morning, Emily walked into the dining room, expecting the usual arrogant smirk from Alexander. Instead, she found him cold, distant. His stormy gray eyes didn't even lift to meet hers. He was pretending that last night meant nothing. Fine, if he wants to pretend, I can too. She sat across from him, sipping her tea in absolute silence. Alexander didn't say a word either. Not a single taunt, not a smirk, nothing. And somehow that hurt more than anything. For days, they avoided each other. They pretended. But the more they tried to ignore it, the worse it got. The tension, the need, the fire, until finally it snapped. It happened one evening when Emily was walking through the library, lost in thought. She didn't hear him enter, didn't realize he was standing behind her until she turned and found herself trapped. His eyes were dark, stormy, full of something she couldn't name. Well, tell me you don't feel it. His voice was raw, hoarse. Tell me you don't think about it every damn second. Emily's breath hitched. I don't. Liar. Alexander's jaw clenched. Then why do you look at me like I'm the only thing you see? She swallowed hard. You think too highly of yourself. He stepped closer. Too close. Say it, Emily. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Because he was right. She did feel it. Every single second. And that scared her more than anything. That night, Emily sat in her room, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't take it anymore. The silence, the distance, the pretending. So she did something reckless. She left her room and walked straight to his. Alexander was sitting by the window, drinking whiskey when she entered. He turned slowly, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her. Emily, she swallowed hard, forcing herself to be brave. We need to talk. He set his glass down, watching her with that unreadable expression. Then he stood, walking toward her, stopping just inches away. And talk. Emily's heart pounded. Why do you keep pushing me away? Alexander tensed. I'm not pushing you away. You kissed me, she whispered. And then you ran. His jaw clenched. Because I can't have you. Her breath caught. Why not? His eyes burned. Because if I let myself love you, Emily, I won't survive losing you. Emily stared at him, stunned. He left her. Oh, God. Her chest tightened, and suddenly she was closing the distance between them, her hands grabbing his shirt, pulling him down as she crashed her lips against his. And this time, he didn't stop her. His arms wrapped around her tightly, as if he was afraid she'd disappear. On their kiss. It was desperate, starving, consuming, because this wasn't a game anymore. This was everything. The next morning, Emily woke up wrapped in Alexander's arms. For the first time, there were no walls between them. But as she looked at him, a thought hit her. She wasn't the only one who had lost something precious. She had too. So she decided to do something crazy. That evening, Alexander walked into the music room and froze. Emily was sitting at the grand piano and playing for him. The melody was soft, heartbreaking, and beautiful. His chest tightened painfully. She looked up, meeting his gaze. This is yours. Her voice was barely a whisper. I want you to have it. Alexander walked toward her slowly, his throat tight. He sat beside her, reaching out to touch her fingers over the keys. Whoa. What? He smiled softly. Because I love you. His breath hitched. She loved him. She loved him. And suddenly he was kissing her again, pulling her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because she was, and he was never letting her go. 2 months later, they stood in the same garden where it all began. But this time, there was no bet, no game. Only them. Alexander got down on one knee, his hands trembling slightly. Emily Carter Knight, I married you once for a stupid bet, but this time I'm asking you for real. Her eyes filled with tears. Will you marry me? She laughed softly, pulling him up and kissing him breathless. Yes, Alexander, 100 times yes. And as he spun her in his arms, under the stars, she realized something. This had never been a game. It had always been fate. The stars shimmered above as Emily stood on the balcony of their mansion, looking out at the city. Everything had changed. She had entered this marriage as a bet, a joke, a game. Now she stood here as Alexander Knight's wife. Not by force, not by contract, but by love. And yet, why was her heart racing? She heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her. Alexander. Her body reacted before she even turned, as if it already knew his presence. Then, his arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. What are you thinking about, Mrs. Knight? His voice was low, husky, teasing. Emily smiled. How different this feels now. Alexander turned her gently in his arms, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His stormy gray eyes locked onto hers. You were never supposed to happen to me, he murmured. Emily's breath hitched. Do you regret it? A slow, lazy smirk curled his lips. At for a single second. Then he leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was slow, deep, and devastatingly soft. A kiss that wasn't about possession anymore. It was about love. The following weekend, Alexander hosted a grand celebration, not for business, not for social status, but for them. Emily walked into the lavish ballroom, now as his wife, but more importantly, as his equal. She no longer felt like the girl who had once been just his maid. She was Emily Carter Knight, the woman who tamed a billionaire. Um, the guests whispered in admiration this time, not judgment. She changed him. I have never seen him like this before. Emily smiled to herself. She hadn't changed him. He had simply found the man he was always meant to be. Then she felt a warm hand wrap around her waist. Alexander leaned in, whispering in her ear, "Have I told you how stunning you look tonight?" Her breath hitched as she turned toward him. Only a few hundred times. His smirk deepened. I should say it a few hundred more then. Then, before everyone, he took her hand and led her to the dance floor. The music started, and as he twirled her effortlessly, she realized something. She had fallen in love with a man she had once sworn to hate. And it was the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to her. After the guests left, Alexander took Emily's hand, leading her to the music room. She arched an eyebrow. "What are we doing here?" He turned to her, his expression softer than she had ever seen. Then he gestured toward the piano. "I have something for you." Emily's heart stuttered. Slowly, she approached the piano, only to find a small box sitting on the keys. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a delicate golden locket, engraved with her initials. Tears burned in her eyes. "Alexander, this is..." He stepped closer, taking the locket and clasping it around her neck. Then, he whispered, "I wanted you to have something that reminded you that you will never be alone again." Emily turned, throwing her arms around him. Her voice broke. I don't deserve you." Alexander tilted her chin up, his gaze burning with intensity. "You don't deserve me?" He chuckled darkly. "Sweetheart, I think you have that backward. I've been yours since the moment you told me you'd never fall for me." Emily laughed through her tears, her heart overflowing with love. She had won the bet after all. Despite the perfect happiness, Emily knew there was one last thing she needed, one final test. So, one evening, she sat beside him in the candlelit garden, holding his hand. What if I lost everything tomorrow?" she asked softly. Alexander frowned, his grip tightening on hers. What?" Emily swallowed hard. "What if I wasn't your wife? What if I didn't have your last name? If I was still just me?" Alexander stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood, pulling her up with him. His hands framed her face, his eyes burning into hers. "Listen to me, Emily." His voice was rough, raw, raw. When did I ever forget an insult? Emily's chest tightened. If you lost everything, I'd still be here. If you walked away right now, I'd follow you. If I had to choose between my empire and you, I'd give it all up in a second. Um, a tear slipped down Emily's cheek. This was it. This was love. Real, true, unbreakable. She threw herself into his arms, her voice a whisper against his lips. "That I'm yours, Alexander, always." And as he kissed her under the moonlight, she knew this was never just a bet. It was destiny. Months passed, and life with Alexander was blissful, passionate, and full of love. But one morning, Emily woke up feeling different, strange, nauseous. She frowned. No, it couldn't be. Her hands shook as she reached for a pregnancy test. Minutes later, she stared at the result, her heart racing. Positive. Wow. Emily pressed a hand over her mouth, overwhelmed with emotion. She was going to have Alexander's child. That evening, Alexander came home to find Emily sitting in the garden, a soft glow in her eyes. He immediately sensed something was different. He approached, his voice gentle. What is it? Emily turned, meeting his gaze. I have something to tell you. His heart pounded. What? She took his hand, placing it gently over her stomach. His eyes widened. Emily? A slow, staggered breath left his lips. Then, a smile, a real one. A chuckle. Then he pulled her into his arms, laughing softly. We're having a baby? His voice was disbelieving, full of wonder. Emily laughed through her tears of joy. Yes, Alexander, we are. And then he kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because she was. She always had been. Years later, in the same mansion where it all began, Emily sat at the piano, playing softly. A small giggle echoed in the room. She turned to see a little girl with gray eyes and a cheeky smile. Her daughter, their daughter. And behind her, Alexander stood, watching his two greatest loves with quiet devotion. He walked forward, scooping their daughter into his arms before pressing a kiss to Emily's forehead. Mrs. Knight, you're still the best thing that ever happened to me. Emily smiled, placing a hand over his. And I always will be. And as their daughter laughed in their arms, they knew. This love story, it was never supposed to happen. But thank God it did. Forever. Emily sat in the nursery, gently rocking in the plush white chair, her hands resting on her growing belly. The soft glow of the lamp bathed the room in warmth, and she couldn't help but smile as she looked at the tiny crib Alexander had insisted on assembling himself. Their baby, their miracle. She sighed, placing a hand over her stomach. You're already so loved, little one. A deep chuckle broke the silence. As much as your mother is. Emily turned, her heart skipping a beat as Alexander leaned against the doorway, dressed in a white shirt, the top few buttons undone, his sleeves rolled up. God, how did he still manage to steal her breath away? His eyes softened as he walked toward her, kneeling beside her chair, his hand covering hers over her belly. You never stop amazing me, Emily. His voice was low, reverent. She smiled, brushing her fingers against his cheek. You never stop making me feel like I belong. Alexander's jaw tightened as if he was holding back something powerful. Then, slowly, he leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to her stomach. You're my world, sweetheart, you and this little one. Emily's chest tightened with emotion. She placed her fingers under his chin, guiding him up until their lips were barely an inch apart. Kiss me, Alexander. His gray eyes darkened. And then, we did. Slow, deep, unrushed. A kiss that wasn't just love, was devotion, it was forever. Emily woke up wrapped in warmth. Alexander's strong arm was draped over her waist, his body pressed against her back, his breath fanning against her neck. Safe, loved, home. She turned slightly, her eyes locking onto his sleeping face. She still wasn't used to seeing him like this. So unguarded, so at peace. She gently brushed her fingers through his dark hair, smiling when he stirred slightly. Watching me sleep, sweetheart? His voice was hoarse with sleep, deep and lazy. She chuckled. Maybe. Alexander cracked one eye open, his smirk lazy but devastating. See something you like? Emily rolled her eyes. You're impossible. He tightened his grip on her waist, rolling her onto her back beneath him. And yet you married me. Twice. Her breath hitched as he leaned down, his lips ghosting over hers. Her fingers curled into his shirt. God, how did he still make her heart race? Like this. Alexander. The door burst open. A small giggle filled the room. Mommy. Alexander groaned, burying his face in Emily's neck. And just like that, my morning is ruined. Emily laughed, gently pushing him off as their tiny daughter climbed onto the bed, jumping between them. You're a little troublemaker. Isla Knight, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's mischievous smile. Alexander sat up, ruffling her curls. And what trouble are you up to, little one? Isla grinned. Mommy said we get pancakes today. Alexander arched an eyebrow at Emily. Did she now? Emily shrugged, smiling innocently. You're the one who promised to cook today. Alexander groaned dramatically, but the love in his eyes was undeniable. He scooped Isla up in his arms, pressing a kiss to her cheek. All right, let's make some pancakes, my little princess. Emily watched them, her heart full. This was her life. Love, laughter, family, and she wouldn't trade it for the world. Months later, after the birth of their second child, Alexander finally decided it was time. He had never taken Emily on a proper honeymoon. So he planned the perfect surprise, a private island, a week with no business, no distractions, just them. Emily stared at the breathtaking beach, the turquoise waves stretching endlessly before them. Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. His lips brushed against her ear. Like it? She sighed, leaning into him. I love it. Then he spun her around, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Alexander! She squealed, laughing. He grinned, carrying her into the villa and straight to the bed, dropping her gently onto the sheets. Then he caged her in, his eyes dark with intent. I've been waiting years for this, Mrs. Knight. Her breath hitched. His lips hovered over hers. What do you say we finally make up for lost time? And as his lips captured hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and utterly consuming, Emily knew. This was for years later on their anniversary. Emily found herself sitting at the grand piano again. She hadn't played in a long time, but tonight felt different. She gently pressed the keys, letting the melody fill the air. And then she felt a presence behind her. Alexander. He stood there, watching her with a soft smile. Play for me? His voice was husky, filled with something deep. Emily met his gaze. Always. And as she played, he walked behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. His chin rested on her shoulder. His heartbeat was steady against her back. And for the first time in years, she realized they had won. They had beaten the odds, the doubts, the fears. Because this love, that was never supposed to happen. But it did. It would last forever. The sun's golden rays poured through the large windows of their mansion, casting a soft glow on the white satin sheets. Emily stirred, feeling the warmth of the man beside her before she even opened her eyes. She wasn't surprised when she felt his lips brush against her bare shoulder. Awake, sweetheart? Alexander's voice was husky, thick with sleep and something deeper. Emily smiled, keeping her eyes closed. Not yet. Alexander's chuckle rumbled against her skin. Liar. Then she felt it, his fingers trailing slowly down her arm, his touch so light that it sent shivers racing down her spine. Her breath hitched when he tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his stormy gray eyes. You know, Mrs. Knight, after all these years, you still take my breath away. Emily's heart clenched. How was it possible that he still looked at her like this, like she was his entire world? She smiled softly. Good, because you're stuck with me forever, Mr. Knight. His smirk deepened, his voice dropping into that sinful tone that always made her knees weak. Forever isn't nearly long enough. Then, before she could respond, he kissed her. And just like that, the world melted away. If there was one thing Emily had learned, it was that being a billionaire's wife and a mother of two was not easy, especially when their children were just as stubborn as their father. That afternoon, the sound of tiny feet running through the mansion echoed down the halls. Mommy, Daddy, Isla took my toy. Emily sighed, shaking her head. Not again. Alexander smirked beside her, sipping his coffee like he was enjoying the show. I wonder where they get the attitude from, Emily muttered. Alexander leaned closer, whispering against her ear, definitely from you. Emily shot him a glare. Excuse me? But before she could say anything else, Isla burst into the room, her little face scrunched up in frustration. Daddy, tell Liam to stop annoying me. Alexander sighed dramatically, setting his cup down. Then he bent down, picking Isla up and spinning her around until she giggled. Tell you what, princess, if Liam keeps bothering you, I'll just buy you a new toy. Emily gasped. Alexander, he winked. What? I'm teaching them the perks of being a knight. Emily sighed, shaking her head. You're impossible. But as she watched him cuddle their daughter, her heart melted all over again. Because even with all the chaos, this was the happiest she had ever been. Oh. That evening, Alexander came home with a secretive smirk on his face. Emily eyed him suspiciously. What are you up to? He pulled her into his arms, his fingers playing with the ends of her hair. Pack a bag, sweetheart. We're leaving tonight. Emily blinked. What? Where are we going? His smirk deepened. Somewhere where you'll have no distractions, no kids, no responsibilities, just us. Her heart raced. Alexander, he leaned in, his breath warm against her lips. It's been too long since I had you all to myself, Mrs. Knight. And I plan to make up for lost time. Emily swallowed hard. Oh, God. She was in trouble. A few hours later, they arrived at a private villa by the ocean, the waves crashing softly against the shore. Emily stared in awe at the breathtaking view from their bedroom, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Then she felt his arms wrap around her from behind. You will like it. This is my brain is like going to blank. Emily sighed, leaning back into his warmth. It's perfect. Then she felt his lips press against the back of her neck. Soft, slow, dangerous. Her breath caught. Alexandra. He turned her around, his gray eyes dark with something primal. Tell me, Emily. His voice was barely a whisper. Do you have any idea what you do to me? Her knees went weak. Then he lifted her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her to the bed. And that night, he reminded her exactly why she fell in love with him in the first place. The next morning, Emily woke up to an empty bed. For a second, panic gripped her chest. Then she saw a single red rose on the pillow beside her, and beneath it, a letter. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. I never thought love was real. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who needed someone. Then you walked into my life and ruined me in the best way possible. You turned my world upside down. You made me laugh when I wanted to be cold. You made me feel when I wanted to be numb. You made me love when I thought I never could. So let me make you a promise, sweetheart. For every day that you wake up beside me, I will remind you that you are the best damn thing that ever happened to me. Forever yours, Alexander. Emily pressed a hand over her mouth, tears burning in her eyes. She turned, only to find Alexander leaning against the doorway, watching her with that heart-stopping smirk. Are you crying, Mrs. Knight? She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. Shut up, Alexander. But before he could say anything else, she rushed into his arms, burying her face in his chest. His arms tightened around her, his lips pressing against her temple. I love you, she whispered. Alexander tilted her chin up, his eyes burning with love. I love you more, sweetheart, and I will love you for the rest of my damn life. Then he kissed her. In that moment, she knew fairy tales weren't just in books, because she was living hers. The golden sun bathed their bedroom in warmth as Emily stirred awake. Even before she opened her eyes, she felt him. His body pressed against hers, his arms wrapped securely around her waist, his breath steady against the back of her neck. After all these years, he still held her like he was afraid to let go. She smiled, turning slowly in his arms. Her heart stuttered at the sight of Alexander's sleeping face. Even now, he looked like the same arrogant billionaire she had once despised. But beneath all of that, he was hers. Hers to wake up to, hers to love, hers forever. She reached out, trailing her fingers along his jawline, brushing a kiss against his forehead. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. And the moment those stormy gray eyes met hers, she knew. She was home. Alexander smirked, his voice husky. "Good morning, Mrs. Knight." Emily rolled her eyes playfully. "After all these years, you still smirk like you own the world." He tightened his arms around her. "I do." He brushed a kiss against her bare shoulder, his voice dropping. "Because I own you." Her breath hitched. Even after all this time, he still had that effect on her. And as his lips trailed lower, fire erupted in her veins. That afternoon, Emily walked into the mansion's grand library, expecting to find their children playing or one of Alexander's employees rushing with documents. Instead, she found something unexpected: a piano, a brand new, gleaming grand piano. Her breath caught in her throat. Alexander stood beside it, his hands in his pockets, watching her with that unreadable expression. "Do you like it?" His voice was gentle, careful. Emily slowly approached, running her fingers over the smooth keys. She could barely whisper, "Alexander." He took a step forward, his voice softer. "I realized something, Emily." Her eyes lifted to his. "The first time I fell in love with you, it was when I saw you play." Emily's heart clenched. His fingers brushed against her cheek. "But I took that away from you. I made you stop." A lump formed in her throat. "You didn't." "I did." His voice was firm. "You were meant to play, sweetheart. And I want to hear you again." Tears burned her eyes. "Alexander." He knelt before her, taking her hands. "Play for me, just once. Let me hear what your love sounds like." Emily inhaled sharply, her heart swelling with emotion. This man, the one she had married for a bet, the one she had once sworn to hate, was now the only man she would ever love. So she sat down and she played. The melody was soft, delicate, filled with every moment they had shared. And when she finished, she turned to find Alexander wiping away a tear. She gasped, "Alexander Knight, are you crying?" He smirked, but his voice was thick with emotion. "Shut up, Emily." And then he kissed her. And just like that, she was his again. That night, Emily had one last secret to share. As Alexander sat in his home office reviewing business contracts, she walked in, holding a small box in her hands. He looked up, arching an eyebrow. "Sweetheart, if this is lingerie, I'm already interested." Emily rolled her eyes. "No, you idiot, it's better." She placed the box on the desk. Alexander leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his gray eyes. When he opened it, his entire body stilled. Inside was a tiny onesie, and on the front it said, "Daddy's newest business partner, coming soon." uh, Alexander's breath hitched. His eyes shot to hers, wide with shock, disbelief, and something even deeper. "Emily." She smiled softly, placing a hand on her stomach. "We're having another baby, Alexander." For the first time in years, Alexander Knight was speechless. Then, in a heartbeat, he was on his feet, crushing her in his arms. "You're serious?" His voice was raw. Emily laughed through her tears. "Yes, Alexander, we're serious." Then, to her absolute shock, Alexander Knight, the ruthless, arrogant billionaire, picked her up and spun her around like a love-struck fool. "I love you, I love you, I love you," he whispered between kisses, his voice shaking. Emily smiled against his lips. "Bravo, Alexander." And just like that, their next adventure began. Years passed, and their love only grew stronger. Alexander never stopped worshiping Emily. Emily never stopped challenging him. and together they built a life full of love, laughter, and family. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their mansion, watching the sunset, Alexander reached for her hand, his fingers laced with hers. Emily sighed happily. What are you thinking about? Alexander smiled softly, bringing her hand to his lips. I'm just wondering how the hell I got so lucky. She laughed. You married your maid, remember? He smirked. Best damn decision of my life. And as he leaned in to kiss her, she knew. This love, it was never supposed to happen, but it did, and it would last forever.